Chicago in 1893 was a city standing with one foot in the future and the other still stumbling through its past. Steel skeletons rose faster than courts could regulate them. Money moved like a current that could drown a conscience. The Columbian Exposition threw light across the nation, and in that glare, shadows lengthened. Into that feverish urban landscape walked a man whose name would be folded into legend, H. Holmes. By one telling, he was an architect of nightmares, the proprietor of a murder castle, responsible for dozens, perhaps hundreds of deaths. By another, he was a con man and a murderer, but not the industrial-scale killer of popular imagination. The question that follows these stories, urgent, simple, and stubborn, is this: how many did H. Holmes really kill? This is not a question we answer by repeating the loudest headline. It is a question that requires paper, ink, and patience. Court records, coroner reports, police logs, insurance ledgers, and the very newspapers that profited from scandal. It requires us to hold two things at once: the human lives implicitly counted by any number, and the messy evidentiary trail that produces such numbers. Many viewers have seen a single figure printed on a t-shirt or repeated in a documentary. 27 or 100 or 200. Those numbers stick because they satisfy a human appetite for neatness. But history is rarely neat. We begin where the city itself began that year, at the fair. The Columbian Exposition framed the late 19th century imagination, hubris and hope on a monumental scale. To many, the fair promised the triumph of science and progress. To others, it exposed the fragile seams beneath modernity. Sensational stories thrive in exactly that ambivalent air. Holes in regulation, rapid population flux, and a press hungry for lurid copy created the conditions in which rumor could harden into accepted fact. In other words, the social context of 1890s Chicago matters. It helps explain how a man like Holmes could be both an object of legal scrutiny and a magnet for myth. The popular narrative tends to begin with architecture. The Murder Castle, a Victorian lodging and commercial block somewhere on the western edge of the fairgrounds, has become shorthand for deliberate, industrialized murder. Accounts describe a labyrinth of sealed rooms, trap doors, gas lines, soundproofed chambers, and a basement designed to dispose of bodies. It is an image that lodges in the mind and does work that facts must later dislodge. To understand what actually happened, we must separate three layers of evidence: contemporaneous police and court documents, sensational newspaper accounts, and later historical reconstructions that often borrow freely from both. Before unraveling those layers, a brief portrait of the man at the center. Born Herman Webster Mudgett, he used the name H. Holmes, and the distinction is instructive. He operated as a physician, as an insurance agent, as a proprietor of boarding houses, and as a salesman and conman, according to trial testimony and business records. He was arrested in late 1894 and brought to trial in the mid-1890s. He was convicted and executed in 1896, Cook County court records and contemporary trial reporting. Those are anchor points that we can rely on with some confidence. Everything between them, how many lives were taken, where precisely in the city they died, and how the remains were handled, needs to be measured against surviving documents. One crucial principle we will use, repeatedly and transparently, is a taxonomy of evidentiary status. When I describe an alleged killing as confirmed, I mean it is backed by multiple primary documents, a coroner's inquest, a prosecutorial filing, and contemporary eyewitness testimony that cohere. Probable cases are those with corroboration from more than one independent source, but lacking definitive forensic closure. Possible cases rest on single, often sensational reports or hearsay. Mythical cases are those for which the only provenance is repeated newspaper copy or later secondary retellings, with no clear primary anchor. I will label each claim accordingly as we proceed. Back to the castle. When journalists and pamphleteers of the day wrote about the building, they supplied detail in abundance. According to several newspaper pieces from 1895 and 1896, investigators uncovered a structure with rooms leading nowhere, secret passages, and chambers insulated against sound. Those reports circulated rapidly and were later retold without always noting their source. But what do the police records and building documents say? Here, the documentary record becomes less dramatic and more frustratingly fragmentary. There are contemporaneous police dispatches and inventory lists for property recovered at Holmes's premises, Chicago police files, available but scattered, as well as receipts for materials and for sales of furnishings. There are reports of excavations and disinterments, coroner's notations, dated entries with varying degrees of detail. Yet there is no surviving complete blueprint that shows an elaborate maze as described in many sensational retellings. Architectural permits of the period, where they survive, indicate a building with retail and lodging functions, common for the neighborhood, municipal building logs, indefinido regarding precise layout. Excavation reports and some police inventories speak of human remains found on the premises. Police reports, coroner notes. But those reports do not always agree with one another on number, identity, or manner of death. In short, the castle existed. The contours of its interior and how it functioned are less certain than many accounts suggest. That uncertainty is not merely academic. Suppose someone claims Holmes murdered a score of people by leading them into soundproof chambers and suffocating them with gas. For that claim to stand as more than a rhetorical flourish, we would need a cluster of corroborating documents. Construction blueprints showing mechanical systems inconsistent with normal plumbing. Contemporaneous testimony from workers who built or altered the space. Coroner reports establishing cause of death, and court filings linking those deaths to Holmes. Often, the historical record supplies only fragments of this pattern. Where fragments align, we can upgrade our confidence. Where they do not, we must downgrade the claim. Which leads us to one of the clearest sources of proliferation for high victim counts: confessions and their retelling. In the months after his arrest, Holmes, according to newspaper reports and some investigator notes, made statements and confessions that varied in content and number. Some accounts say he admitted to 27 deaths. Others quote him as making grander claims. It is important to note that confessions, especially in the late 19th century, were an unstable genre. They could be coerced, misreported, edited by reporters seeking a sensational turn, or inflated by intermediaries with financial or reputational motives. A confession printed in a newspaper is not the same as a confession transcribed in a courtroom under oath and verified by legal counsel. In Holmes's case, the provenance of many reported confessions is complicated. Newspaper accounts, police notebooks, reporter transcripts, often with gaps. We must therefore treat the widely cited figure of 27 as an allegation whose reliability needs independent corroboration. At the center of the legal unraveling was Holmes's connection with Benjamin Pitezel. Pitezel was an associate whose death, and the curious circumstances surrounding the fate of his children, became the subject of formal prosecution. Trial transcripts and prosecutorial records reference Pitezel. Understanding Pitezel's role is essential because it is one of the clearest strands in the evidentiary web. Pitezel's death triggered specific investigations, charges were laid, testimony produced, and records created. Where those records exist, we classify the related outcomes as stronger evidence. But even in the Pitezel matter, the record retains its jaggedness. There are testimonies and affidavits and insurance policies pointing to fraud. There are also sensational columns that compress and dramatize those findings for readers. And there are aspects of that story, exact sequences of events, certain transactions, that remain indefinido in the surviving documents available to us in this brief. When facts are indefinido, that is not a failing of historians, so much as a statement of respect for the limits of the archive. We should pause, then, to consider motive and method without slipping into psychological speculation beyond what the documents permit. The archival picture suggests Holmes was, at minimum, a seasoned fraudster who used the trappings of respectability, medical schooling on paper, business offices, property ownership, to access victims and profit from their misfortune, insurance records, business ledgers. He sold health remedies, sold property, and purchased life insurance policies on acquaintances, insurance documents, contemporaneous depositions. Those patterns ground a plausible motive for certain killings, financial gain through insurance fraud, or elimination of inconvenient partners. But motivation does not equate to mass industrial killing without corroboration. It can explain why certain documented murders occurred while leaving broader claims of serial slaying hanging in the air. One of the persistent confusions in the Holmes story is the difference between what contemporaries reported finding at the castle and what later retellings convert into definitive proof. For example, early dispatches reported bones and other remains on the property, quoted phrase in multiple 1895 newspapers. Later narrators read that shorthand as evidence of dozens of bodies systematically destroyed in mechanical chambers. A sober reading of the primary material shows the presence of human remains at the site is documented in several contemporaneous sources. But the number, condition, and identity of those remains are unevenly recorded. Police inventories, coroner entries, partial and sometimes contradictory. The presence of remains is a grave and important fact. The leap to a precise, large tally requires more consistent corroboration than we currently possess. That leap is also logistically constrained. Chicago's building records, city maps, and neighborhood topography restrict what any single lot could accommodate. If one is told Holmes murdered 200 people in a single block over 2 or 3 years, it invites a set of logistical questions. How were bodies transported, stored, and disposed of without attracting sustained local testimony? How did sewer, building, and garbage systems of the period accommodate such activity? Forensic and logistical constraints do not disprove numbers on their own, but they press historians to demand documentation commensurate with extraordinary claims. Often, the documentation is thinner than the claim. The press played an essential role in converting rumor to accepted fact. Newspapers in the 1890s competed fiercely for readers. A lurid account printed on a single page could be picked up and reprinted in dozens of publications across the country, rarely with rigorous source attribution. Some of the earliest and most vivid descriptions of the castle come from newspapers whose pages were driven more by circulation than by investigative rigor. Chicago Tribune and various syndicated sensationalist papers, see contemporaneous press roll. Subsequent retellings, books, magazine features, popular histories, often cite those original newspapers without returning to the archive to weigh corroborating police or court records. The result is an echo chamber, where an initial, perhaps speculative report becomes the foundation of a consolidated narrative. This disciplinary hazard, the repetition of unverified claims, shapes the story entirely. Consider the commonly cited figure of 200 victims. Tracing that number reveals that it appears sporadically in secondary accounts and popular retellings, rarely with a primary source citation that holds up. More plausible is that a variety of numbers circulated in the immediate aftermath, some from Holmes himself, reported confessions, some from journalists, exaggerated or speculative, and some from idle rumor. Over time, the largest numbers attract attention because they are memorable. They are also, historically, the most difficult to substantiate. It is here we must be absolutely candid. The evidence-based minimum number of victims that can be confirmed solely from the surviving primary sources available in this brief is indefinido. That is not an evasion. It is a methodological decision rooted in respect for the archive and for the victims. To assert a precise minimum without assembling court files, coroner inquests, and the full body of police reports would be irresponsible. That said, the documentary record does contain discrete, comparatively well-documented cases tied to Holmes, cases that we will examine carefully. One of those involves Benjamin Petezel, whose death became one of the pillars of Holmes's prosecution, trial transcripts, prosecutorial files. Beyond the confirmed and the indefinido, there exists a middle domain of probable and possible victims. Probable cases are those where multiple independent contemporary sources point in the same direction, coroner notations plus corroborating witness statements, for example, but where some forensic closure is lacking. Possible cases are often single-source claims or later secondary retellings that cite no primary documents. Both categories demand different kinds of historical treatment. Probable cases warrant careful reconstruction and cautious attribution. Possible cases require explicit labeling as such and a clear indication of the archival work needed to upgrade or downgrade their status. At this point, one might reasonably ask, if we cannot, from this brief alone, produce a precise number of victims, what can we do in the remainder of the investigation? We can do several things. First, we can assemble a list of named individuals whose deaths intersect with Holmes according to surviving records and mark each with a status label: confirmed, probable, possible, or myth. Second, we can trace the provenance of high-number claims through newspapers, confession reports, and later authors to show precisely how and when inflation occurred. Third, we can evaluate the physical evidence from the castle in the context of what is possible in late 19th century urban architecture and municipal record-keeping. Finally, and crucially, we can center the human cost. Wherever there is a name that can be tied credibly to a death associated with Holmes, that name deserves attention. Before proceeding to individual cases, it is worth noting the archival priorities that would most efficiently clarify remaining ambiguities, targets for any researcher who wants to move from speculative totals to documented counts. Chief among these are the Cook County court records, trial filings, sentencing, and appeals, Chicago Police Department case files for the relevant precincts, evidence inventories, investigative notes, coroner inquest transcripts and death certificates, where extant, insurance company ledgers and policy filings for tracing motive through financial benefit, and the administrative records of the Columbian Exposition to map neighborhood movement and lodging patterns during the fair. Also valuable are contemporary newspapers, both metropolitan papers like the Chicago Tribune and smaller regional and national syndicates, to reconstruct how public narratives formed. Where archival holdings are incomplete, municipal building permits and tax records can help reconstruct the physical footprint of the so-called castle. Archival targets as recommended: Chicago Police Archives, Cook County Court Records, Chicago Coroner's Inquests, Columbian Exposition Administrative Files, Municipal Building and Tax Records. Now, moving from the general to the specific, we begin the close reading of the evidence. We start where legal certainty is strongest, the prosecution and trial sequence that culminated in Holmes's execution in 1896. The trial records, where we have them, establish certain facts with clarity. Holmes was indicted on certain counts related to fatal outcomes. Witnesses testified to specific transactions and interactions. The jury ultimately convicted him. The state imposed capital punishment. Trial transcripts, sentencing documents. Those procedural facts are anchors. Around those anchors are strands of evidence that either reinforce or complicate the narrative. Testimony about insurance policies, statements from neighbors and employees, inventories of property, receipts for materials used in the building, and field notes from investigators. One particularly substantial thread concerns the Peterzel series of events. Peterzel's death not only provided prosecutors with the most immediate charge on which to base a capital case, it also offered a nexus of documents, insurance claims, affidavits, and witness statements that are relatively well preserved. The Peterzel matter draws our attention for a reason. It is one of the clearer places where motive, method, and documented outcome converge. That clarity is why many historians and journalists point to Peterzel as a central corroborated case in assessing Holmes's culpability. There are, however, cases that fall into a less certain category. Individuals recorded in newspaper accounts as missing and later alleged to be victims, but for whom coroner identification is absent or incomplete. These names, when they appear, deserve to be treated with caution and respect. We will list them, explain the archival status of each claim, and assign the appropriate evidentiary label. When a name cannot be reliably tied to Holmes by primary documents, we will mark the attribution as probable or possible rather than confirmed. This is not a denial of tragedy. It is a refusal to let rumor eclipse careful truth-seeking. It is here, near the point where we will begin examining individual cases one by one, that the story pauses to ask a broader historiographical question. How do we remember criminals like Holmes without erasing the victims they left behind? Public memory tends to simplify. Monsters are reduced to numbers, crimes to a single emblematic building, victims to footnotes in a narrative about evil itself. A historian's duty is different. It is to reconstruct, as far as documents allow, who these people were, how they lived and died, and how institutional forces at the time responded, or failed to respond. That means laboring through probate files, insurance claims, and bread-and-butter municipal records as much as through grisly headlines. Our next section will move into that labor. We will begin a patient, evidence-by-evidence accounting. We will examine named individuals for whom documentary traces survive, and we will place each in the taxonomy of confirmed, probable, possible, or myth. We will follow the paper trail that links Holmes to these lives. Bills, cancelled checks, policy applications, witness affidavits, and inquests. And we will continue to ask uncomfortable questions about how much of the legend has been built on the foundations of sound journalism and how much on the sand of sensationalism. If this investigation is the kind of work you want to see more of, subscribe and stay with us as we move deeper into the files. Each document is a piece of a life, and each life deserves to be traced with care. For those who wish to follow the archival path themselves, consult the description below for a preliminary bibliography and suggested repositories where the primary sources discussed here may be found. We will begin in the next segment with the most documented thread, the events surrounding Benjamin Pitezel and the children who became central to the prosecution. We will read the trial testimony, weigh coroner notes, and pass the insurance ledgers. That line of inquiry will show how a single, well-documented case can serve as both a foundation for conviction and a mirror for the greater uncertainties that surround the broader victim counts. The documents will not simply tell us what happened. They will show how stories were told, disputed, and recorded, how the public record itself became a battleground for truth. As we move into those records, keep in mind the principle that will guide us. Whenever we ascribe death to Holmes, we will say on what basis that ascription rests. We will mark each case with the appropriate evidentiary label and indicate what further archives would be needed to upgrade or downgrade that assessment. We owe that rigor to the victims and to history. To begin the case-by-case accounting is to enter the archive in a focused way. It is to follow receipts and ledgers into parlors, to read letters that tie a man to a policy, to see where testimony names a driver, a boarding house keeper, a hired hand. It is to recognize the mundane paperwork that inks over the human dramas of the period. The evidence is made up of small, stubborn things, signatures, dates, cancelled checks, names penciled into ledgers. Together, they can give shape to a sequence of events that rumor alone cannot. We open with the Pitezel file. The documents here illustrate the kind of evidentiary cluster that produces a confident historical assessment, and they also show the limits of what documentation can do. The Pitezel materials include an inventory of insurance policies naming beneficiaries, witness statements about financial transactions, and trial testimony linking actions of Holmes to financial motives, trial transcript, insurance filings, witness affidavits. These are the materials that let prosecutors push toward a capital verdict. But even within this comparatively rich set, there are gaps. Some coroner reports are sparse. Some depositions contradict each other in minor but important ways. Some records that might have clarified intent are missing or were never created. We will go through these documents in careful detail. We will extract names, dates, and the sequence of transactions that chain Holmes to Pitezel and to other victims potentially connected via insurance fraud. We will also identify the places where the archive fails us, where the record goes dark and the line between a probable killing and a possible rumor blurs. At the end of that examination, we will be in a stronger position to say what the most defensible, evidence-based victim range looks like and why the larger, more dramatic numbers circulating in popular culture are difficult to sustain. We will have shown not only what is known, but how the known sits inside a field of uncertainty. But first, the Pitezel documents. They are, in some ways, the test case for our method. They will show us what a corroborated sequence of fraud and lethal outcome looks like on paper. And they will show us, more subtly, how the legal apparatus of the era attempted to construe motive and responsibility in a world that often lacked the forensic tools to make such constructions simple. Proceeding one paper at a time,
We will reconstruct the chain of events that brought investigators from suspicion to indictment. We will follow payments, signatures, and the movement of persons across the city. We will read the testimony that jurors heard, and we will compare it to the contemporaneous press accounts that shaped public perception.
And as we do, we will keep returning to the central, humane question behind every statistic. What do these documents tell us about the lives interrupted, the families left unpaid, and the institutional failures that allowed rumors to take root? We pick up the paper trail in the Pitezel files, the locus where documentary clarity is greatest and where, more than anywhere else, motive, transaction, and fatal outcome come into focus. Benjamin Pitezel was an associate of Herman Webster Mudgett, who used the name H. Holmes. The contemporaneous prosecutorial materials, witness testimony entered at trial, and insurance ledgers connect Pitezel to Holmes in ways that the jury in Cook County found persuasive enough to return a capital conviction, trial transcripts, prosecutorial filings, insurance records. That cluster of documents is our first model of how a killing tied to Holmes looks on paper. Signatures, policy applications, receipts, and living witnesses who could place men and children in certain places at certain times. The essential facts, insofar as surviving public records allow us to say them plainly, are these. Pitezel and Holmes had a business relationship that involved insurance schemes and fraudulent transactions, insurance filings, business ledgers. At some point, Pitezel died under suspicious circumstances that prompted a criminal investigation. The state prosecuted with a set of witnesses who testified about transactions, movements, and payments that linked Holmes to the fatal outcome. Jurors convicted on at least one capital count. Trial transcripts, sentencing docket. Those procedural facts are not indefinido. They are the firm ground on which the state acted. Beyond the conviction itself, the Pitezel matter radiates outward into a set of disputed facts that bear directly on how we count victims. First, Pitezel's death intersects with the fate of his children. Children whose later disappearances and deaths were central to the public sensation around Holmes and to portions of the prosecution. The documentary record here is mixed. There exist witness statements and press accounts placing the children in the orbit of Holmes. There are insurance papers and correspondence that show transfers of money and changes in policy beneficiary designations. And there is trial testimony that offers sequences of events implicating Holmes. But some of the coroner inquests and other forensic notations are incomplete or ambiguous in ways that matter for counting dead bodies with confidence. Coroner notes, witness affidavits, indefinido for certain identification details. For example, the presence of bones at a property and the names associated with policies are not the same as a positively identified, forensically substantiated death attributable beyond reasonable doubt to a single perpetrator. Where records cohere, insurance papers tied to beneficiary changes, corroborating witness testimony about transfers of children between persons, our confidence grows. Where they do not, our classification must reflect that fracture. The Pitezel documents therefore illustrate two crucial principles of our method. First, motive matters. Insurance and fraud are not peripheral to Holmes's activities. They are often the axis around which particular lethal episodes revolve. Insurance company ledgers, business correspondence. Second, even in a comparatively well-documented case, archival quiet spots remain, missing pages, incomplete inquests, and affidavits that contradict one another in detail, so that legal resolution, a conviction, can coexist with evidentiary ambiguity about the full scope of involvement and about precisely which deaths can be tied beyond question to Holmes. In short, prosecution does not automatically equal a complete accounting of victims. From the Pitezel cluster, we widen the aperture. The documentary landscape around Holmes contains items of varying evidentiary weight, property inventories taken by police, Chicago Police Department files, sparse coroner notes, Cook County coroner's records, receipts and canceled checks, business ledgers, and a large amount of press reporting, some of it careful, much of it sensational. When we place these items into the taxonomy established earlier, confirmed, probable, possible, myth, we see a gradation. Confirmed. Cases supported by multiple independent primary documents tallying together in consistent fashion. Coroner's inquest, prosecutorial filing, and credible eyewitness testimony. Based on the documents available in the records compiled for this investigation, the Pitazell prosecution represents the clearest confirmed connection between Holmes and a death that led to conviction, trial transcripts, prosecutorial records. Other cases that have been treated by some historians as confirmed may lack one of these pillars when the primary sources are re-examined. Where that is true, we reclassify those instances as probable or possible rather than confirmed. Probable, deaths for which several independent contemporary sources point in the same direction, but where forensic closure is absent. Examples in this category include individuals who were last seen boarding with Holmes or who had sizable insurance policies benefiting parties associated with him. Contemporaneous interviews and depositions corroborate the disappearance or death, but lack a complete coroner's identification tying the remains to a named person. In these cases, the documentary pattern suggests culpability, but leaves room for reasonable doubt about particulars, police interviews, insurance filing anomalies, witness depositions. Possible, single-source claims, sensational newspaper accounts without corroborating legal or coroner records, or statements appearing only in later secondary literature. Possible cases often rest on an assertion repeated so often that it acquires the weight of fact in popular conversation. In the Holmes narrative, many of the popularly cited names fall into this class, reported in print, repeated in books, rarely anchored to a complete independent archive, syndicated newspaper stories, later secondary retellings. Myth, narratives or numerical totals that cannot be traced to a primary documentary anchor. This includes the oft-repeated figure of 200 victims which, on close inspection, appears primarily in later retellings and popular compendia, with little or no substantiating primary evidence. The figure of 27 has a somewhat firmer provenance in contemporaneous press reports and alleged confessions, but it still does not meet the standard of multiple, independent primary documents if examined claim by claim. Thus, both figures, 27 and 200, should be treated as unverified totals, whose provenance depends heavily on sensational reportage and on Holmes's own variable statements, newspaper archives, investigator notebooks, later secondary sources. It is worth pausing to trace how a number morphs into myth. The mechanics are mundane. An interviewer prints a breathless account. A competing paper reprints it without verification. A popular book cites the report, and the internet eventually codifies the book's assertion into a concise figure that serves as cultural shorthand. This is precisely what happened with Holmes. Early press coverage, understandably focused on arrest and the lurid details that sell newspapers, circulated claims drawn from police interviews and from statements attributed to Holmes himself. Some of those statements may have been direct, others likely passed through intermediaries, reporters, detectives, or jailhouse visitors, whose notes were not always complete or exact. Over time, the story that sold the most copies was the one that shaved ambiguity into certainty. The castle was not merely a boarding house, but a factory of death. The proprietor was not merely a conman, but an industrial killer. Narrative efficiency triumphed over archival caution. Modern historiography has pushed back against that efficiency with varying degrees of skepticism. Erik Larsson's The Devil in the White City, 2003, brought Holmes back into the public imagination. Laminar, cinematic storytelling that juxtaposed the Columbian Exposition and the crimes associated with Holmes. Larsson's work popularized Holmes for a new audience and, in the process, amplified numbers and images that had previously circulated more quietly. Adam Selzer and other recent researchers have re-examined the primary material with an eye to separating what the archives can support from what later narratives embellish. Selzer's work, in particular, cautions readers against accepting large totals without primary documentary corroboration and recommends a careful reading of police and coroner files. Modern Scholarship, Selzer's Critical Reassessments. The disagreement among these modern voices is not about whether Holmes committed murder, he did, but about the scale and logistics of those crimes. A constructive way forward is to examine specific names and claims against the evidentiary standard we set earlier. We have already addressed the Petezel case, which holds a central place because of the connected insurance records, witness testimony, and the legal outcome. The next tier, probable cases, often involves people who were connected to Holmes through business interactions, who purchased lodging from him, or who disappeared after entering his employment. Contemporary police ledgers and some coroner notes reference remains or items traceable to boarding house occupants. Where multiple such sources converge, we may rightly call a case probable. But even here, detailed identification often remains indefinido. A coroner may have listed unknown male, age approx. 30, rather than a named individual, or an inventory may list bones and clothing without clear provenance to a person known to have been in Holmes's care. Police inventories, coroner notations, some entries lacking identifying information. Possible cases proliferate in the press. These include numerous missing persons reports from across the country, people who may have traveled to Chicago for the fair, who may have stayed in boarding houses, and who may have vanished. In a bustling, transient city during the Columbian Exposition, disappearances were not rare, and record-keeping was uneven. The mere coincidence of a missing person's last known location or of their purchase of a railway ticket does not link them to a single suspect without corroborative documents. Yet narrative wants closure, and closure in popular versions of the Holmes story takes the form of neat lists and tidy pronouncements. If we are to be exacting, we must also examine what physical evidence the police actually recovered at properties associated with Holmes, and we must differentiate between documented finds and narrative excess. Several contemporary accounts refer to human remains on the premises. Police inventories and coroner notes record the discovery of bones and other materials. Police dispatch logs, coroner records. But the numbers and identities attached to these finds vary across records. A police inventory compiled at one time may list remains discovered in a cellar. A subsequent inventory compiled as other rooms were opened may add what appears to be a second set of remains. A coroner's note might be terse and not provide identification. The upshot, remains were found, and their discovery is documented in primary materials, but the documents do not consistently produce a ledger of named victims that would support a large, specific tally. Technical limitations of the period compound this problem. Forensic anthropology and reliable methods of DNA identification did not exist in the 1890s. Teeth, clothing, and personal effects were the main avenues for identification, often subjective and commonly recorded in shorthand by coroners and police. Bodies recovered from advanced stages of decomposition posed particular problems. Moreover, the investigative practices of the era did not always preserve chain of custody standards that later forensic science would demand. Therefore, even when remains were recovered and recorded, connecting them to missing persons or to a named individual, let alone establishing homicidal intent attributable specifically to Holmes, required more documentary linkage than typically survives, coroner inquest limitations, investigative practices of the period. Logistics again supply a useful check on high-end claims. If Holmes had murdered dozens of people in a single building over a short span, it is reasonable to expect multiple contemporaneous witnesses to unusual activity, neighbors seeing bodies moved, servants refusing to work, odors noticed, unusual traffic, or for municipal services to have recorded abnormal patterns. The relative absence of such consistent public complaint in the surviving record is noteworthy. That absence does not prove that many murders did not occur, but it does make very large figures, hundreds of victims, less plausibly supported by the kind of documentary trail we would expect to find. Large-scale killing in one residential commercial block typically produces municipal paperwork, multiple coroner inquiries, and repeated prosecutorial actions. The Holmes archive shows some coroner inquiries and at least one major prosecution, but not the continuous municipal record we would anticipate for an industrialized murder operation. Again, the documentary gap is not exculpatory, but it is decisive for method. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary documentation, which we do not find in abundance here. Municipal files, coroner archives, neighborhood testimony, largely absent or fragmentary. We must also attend to how Holmes represented himself and how others represented him in writing. Holmes was adept at assuming the trappings of respectability, a degree or its appearance, business cards, offices and social connections, business directories, professional letters, some of which are indefinido in full provenance. Those trappings provided cover for fraud and for the exploitation of vulnerable people, lodgers, employees, and business partners. Testimony in trials and depositions shows a pattern of deception and manipulation that explains motive for individual murders tied to financial gain. But pattern of fraud does not equate to a particular numeric total in the absence of corroborative documentation for each alleged killing. Turning now to the question you came here to ask, how many did H. Holmes really kill? We must provide at least 3 different figures or contexts to illuminate the divergence in sources, and we must do so with the qualifiers demanded by the archive.
First, contemporaneous legal fact. Holmes was convicted and executed in 1896. The conviction related to at least one killing connected to the Pittizel matter, trial transcripts, sentencing documents. This is the single most secure legal datum. He was executed for murder. If by how many victims one means for how many homicides was he legally convicted, the contemporary record is definite. The court found him guilty on the charges prosecuted to conviction. Court records.
The exact number of felony counts that resulted in conviction is a matter for specific court docket citation. Cook County Court Records. Consult description for precise filing numbers. In the absence of pulling every docket number here, we acknowledge that legal conviction serves as an anchor, but that conviction on limited counts does not preclude additional unprosecuted killings. Second, contemporaneous claims and alleged confessions. In the weeks and months after his arrest, reporters and some police notes record confessions attributed to Holmes. The number most often associated with these reported confessions is 27, a figure that appears in multiple press accounts of the time, newspaper archives. That figure, however, should be treated with caution. The provenance often traces back to interviews and notebooks compiled for readers, and the confessions themselves appear to have been variable in content and context. Investigator notebooks, press reports. Sometimes Holmes is reported as having boasted or joked about numbers. At other times he may have been more circumspect. Confessions in newspapers are not court transcriptions. Their evidentiary value is conditional. Therefore, 27 is best read as a contemporaneous reported total, important in understanding public perception, but not as an archivally confirmed ledger. Third, modern scholarly estimates. Contemporary historians who have revisited the archive have produced lower estimates than the larger popular totals. Works of critical scholarship, including careful re-examinations of police files and of coroner records, tend to place Holmes's probable victims in the low double digits at most. Modern historiography, critical reassessments. Those estimates vary among researchers and hinge on how one treats probable versus possible attributions. Some scholars, after combing through coroner records, insurance ledgers, and municipal filings, suggest a defensible range that emphasizes a handful of confirmed deaths, several probable ones, and a larger group of possible cases that cannot be decisively tied to Holmes without more archival evidence. Crucially, most contemporary scholarly work stops well short of endorsing the upper-end popular figure of 200. Putting those 3 frames together, we can offer a reasoned synthesis without pretending to certainty. From the present evidence assembled, and from the careful re-examination of primary materials in the scholarly literature, 3 points are defensible. There is at least one legally confirmed murder directly tied to Holmes's prosecution, the Pittizel-related conviction, trial and sentencing documents. That is not trivial. It is the legal core of his criminal culpability. There are several additional deaths and disappearances documented in contemporaneous sources that align with Holmes's circle of property and business dealings. Multiple sources, police inventories, coroner notes, insurance documents, and witness statements converge on the likelihood of additional victims beyond the legally convicted count. Those cases can be classified as probable when supported by more than one independent primary document, and as possible when supported by a single or wholly secondary source. Very large numbers, figures in the dozens above the mid-teens or any claims approaching 200, lack the consistent independent documentary support we would require to treat them as credible historical totals. Their provenance is traceable to sensational reporting and to later retellings that did not return to the primary materials for verification.
Given those points, what is the most responsible way to state a range? The DNA of our method compels caution. The defensible lower bound based solely on the primary documents referenced in this investigation is, in this brief, indefinido. Saying otherwise would be to assert specificity where the archive, as reviewed here, resists it.
That said, when we incorporate the broader secondary scholarship that has methodically interrogated the primary documents, scholarly monographs and archival studies, the most careful modern estimates place the number of victims who can be credibly tied to Holmes in a range that suggests a handful of confirmed deaths, several probable ones, and additional possible victims. In plain terms, a modest, evidence-based reading points toward a total in the low double digits at most, not in the high dozens or hundreds often circulated in popular narratives, modern historiographical consensus, critical reassessment literature. Why does this matter? Partly because numbers frame memory. When public culture insists on a single sensational figure, the human identities behind individual listings tend to fade into the number itself. The historian's duty is to recover names and particulars where possible and to preserve uncertainty where it remains. For families whose ancestors were among the disappeared, for communities who lost loved ones, a name and a documented sequence of events matter more than a rounded memorable number. So what would it take to move an indefinido lower bound into a definite one? The investigative priorities are concrete. Secure full access to Cook County Court records, including every pleading and docket entry related to Holmes's indictments and any ancillary civil suits. Obtain complete transcriptions of coroner inquests with chain of custody notes, where extant. Search Chicago Police Department case files for inventories and investigator notebooks, including dates, itemized property lists, and witness interviews. Audit insurance ledgers for anomalies, policy applications, beneficiary changes, and claim payouts tied to persons connected to Holmes, and consult Columbian Exposition administrative files to understand population movement and lodging patterns during the fair. Where identification is uncertain, contemporary probate files, cemetery records, and shipping manifests for trains and boats may also provide linkage. In sum, a meticulous document-first archival campaign is the only avenue to reduce uncertainty meaningfully. Those targets, Cook County Court and coroner records, Chicago police files, insurance company archives, Columbian Exposition records, are the exact repositories researchers should pursue, archival targets. Tracing the origin of inflated counts is also instructive for historians and for the public. The figure of 27 likely originates in the immediate post-arrest period, a combination of alleged jailhouse confessions and press recapitulation, whereas much larger figures like 200 seem to accrete in secondary retellings and popular retellings of the 20th and 21st centuries. Writers and compilers who relied on sensational newspapers without returning to police or coroner records propagated the larger figures. In some cases, the numbers attached to Holmes seem to function symbolically. They quantify an almost mythic evil rather than catalog a precisely documented human toll. Recognizing that symbolic function helps explain why the mythology persists despite archival nuance. But myth not only inflates, it also simplifies. The murder castle image is a case study in narrative condensation. Newspapers and later popular books shaped an image of a singular architectural horror, a building modified by its owner for killing, because a tangible location makes a story concrete. Locations help narrativize complexity. The castle does exist in the record as a building Holmes owned and operated, in part as lodging and commercial space, property records, Municipal tax logs. The sensational description, trapdoors, soundproof rooms, gas pipes purposefully installed for suffocating victims, relies on a mix of contemporaneous reporting and later extrapolation from fragmented accounts. Where blueprints or complete architectural permits survive, they depict a mixed-use building rather than an industrial slaughterhouse, municipal building permits, indefinido regarding complete blueprints. That gap between what the building was and what it became in popular imagination illustrates the interaction between rumor, narrative need, and documentary absence. The castle became both a real site of investigation and a symbol upon which the public could graft its fears of urban modernity. The cultural afterlife of Holmes is consequential. He became, in public memory, a vessel into which anxieties about the new industrial city were poured, an emblem of a place where anonymity could facilitate exploitation. The Columbian Exposition sharpened such dichotomies. It celebrated progress even as it exposed vulnerabilities, transient populations, lax regulation, and the widening social gulf between prosperity and precarity. Holmes's story is thus less a unique aberration and more a revealing episode in the era's social history. The popularity of the narrative, its retellings in books, television documentaries, and online media, reflects both the human fascination with horror and an historical appetite for moral clarity. But moral clarity achieved through distorted numbers does a disservice to victims and to facts. What, then, should responsible historical memory preserve? First, names where they can be verified. Each person documented in court records, coroner files, or credible witness testimony deserves to be named and their story summarized. How they entered Holmes's orbit, what the documents record about their disappearance or death, and what institutional responses followed. Second, an explicit accounting of uncertainty. Every attribution should carry an evidentiary label, confirmed, probable, possible, or myth, so that readers do not confuse narrative flourish with archival fact. Third, the preservation of context, the structural conditions, economic incentives, the transience of a fare-driven city, police and coroner practices, and the press economy, that made both exploitation and sensationalization more likely. Finally, a set of research priorities that archival scholars, amateur historians, and institutional stewards can pursue to clarify remaining ambiguities, archival targets and priorities. A final historian's caveat: refusing to accept inflated numbers is not the same as minimization. The people whose lives intersected with Holmes's enterprises suffered real harm. Where names are documented, they deserve biography. Where bodies were recovered, they deserve respectful acknowledgement. Where family members pursued insurance claims or contested estates, those papers deserve scrutiny. The task of the historian is not to rescue a murderer from notoriety or to shrink his crimes, but to place each claim in the context of documentary support, and in so doing, to preserve the memory of victims as individuals rather than as a single aggregated score. We close with a concise synthesis. The most secure legal fact: Holmes was tried, convicted, and executed in the 1890s, Cook County court records. The most commonly repeated contemporaneous reported figure, 27, derives from reported jailhouse confessions and press accounts, but it lacks complete corroboration when subjected to primary document verification. The largest popular figure, 200, cannot be reliably traced to robust primary documentation and appears to have accreted in secondary retellings. Modern scholarly reassessment tends toward far lower numbers than some popular accounts, often placing likely victims in the low double digits when probable and possible cases are aggregated. Given the material we have reviewed and the methodological constraints of the period, forensic limits, incomplete coroner records, variable police documentation, the most defensible public posture is to offer a reasoned range rather than a single definitive total. A handful of confirmed deaths as anchored in court and coroner records, several probable additional victims grounded in converging contemporaneous documents, and a wider set of possible victims resting on single source or secondary claims. Very large figures remain unsubstantiated by primary evidence accessible in the archives cited here. If you take away only two things from this investigation, let them be these. First, numbers matter, but context matters more. To remember victims is to name them where we can, and to admit uncertainty where documentation fails us, rather than to prefer a tidy total that obscures individual lives. Second, historical method is a moral practice. The honesty of documentation protects the dignity of victims and prevents myth from supplanting the labor of reconstruction. For those who want to dig deeper, the most valuable next steps are archival and procedural. Obtain full Cook County court dockets and trial files. Request coroner inquest transcripts and death certificates. Examine Chicago Police Department case files, including evidence inventories and investigator notes. Audit insurance company ledgers for policy details, and consult Columbian Exposition administrative records to understand the demographic movement that made Chicago in 1893 uniquely vulnerable to both fraud and rumor. Those records will either tighten the range or confirm the limits of what we can know. History often asks us to balance the hunger for narrative with the humility of uncertainty. The Holmes story sits squarely at that intersection. It is a story of documented crime and convincing fraud. It is also a story thick with rumor, with press hyperbole, and with the human tendency to prefer drama to nuance. A cautious, evidence-first reading does not make the reality of victims less real. It honors them by insisting that when we say a life was taken, we be able to say on what basis we make that claim. If this investigation has been useful to you, please join the channel for further archival deep dives. We will place a bibliography of primary and secondary sources in the description so you can follow the documents yourself. In the comments, I invite respectful discussion about historiography and about how the public remembers violent crime in history. Above all, let us keep the names of the documented victims central rather than reducing them to a single arresting number.